Some lives are buried so completely that even their own confessions disappear for generations. When the truth finally surfaces, it reveals not just individual secrets, but the systematic machinery designed to erase them. What becomes of a society that spends centuries perfecting the art of making people vanish from their own stories? This was not a man who lived quietly through his forbidden desires. This was a Grand Duke whose entire posthumous reputation was obliterated in 1994 when his private diary surfaced, revealing decades of concealed same-sex relationships that had been successfully hidden from the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and nearly 80 years of historical scholarship. Konstantin Konstantinovich Romanov lost his carefully constructed legacy the moment those diary pages were published. For nearly a century, he had been remembered as the devoted family patriarch, the accomplished poet who signed his works K.R., the trusted uncle of Tsar Nicholas II, who served as president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. All of that institutional protection evaporated when preserved archival records revealed the systematic deception that had defined his entire adult life. The 1994 publication of his candid personal diaries exposed what Russian court records had never documented: that one of the empire's most publicly conservative Grand Dukes had been living a double existence for decades, visiting male brothels in St. Petersburg while maintaining the facade of imperial respectability. Court memoranda had preserved no trace of surveillance. Diplomatic correspondence contained no whispers of scandal. The institutional machinery of the Russian Empire had been completely bypassed. These records were never meant to be fully opened, but each file that continues to surface depends on how many people choose to remain inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel if you wish to continue uncovering these sealed royal records. What the published diary entries revealed was not merely personal struggle, but evidence of a sophisticated system of institutional blindness. Archived correspondence shows that Konstantin Konstantinovich had operated for years within arm's reach of the imperial court, without arousing official suspicion. Palace records indicate he attended family gatherings, official ceremonies, and state functions, while simultaneously maintaining what his own diary described as visits to several of the male brothels of St. Petersburg. The documentation reveals a man who had successfully compartmentalized his existence so completely that even his immediate family remained unaware. Preserved letters between family members contain no references to suspicious behavior. Military service records from his time in the Imperial Guards show no disciplinary actions, despite what his diary would later reveal were his first homosexual experiences during that period. The historical record demonstrates that Konstantin Konstantinovich had achieved what few royal figures ever managed: complete institutional invisibility regarding his private life. For decades, he had attended Orthodox services, fulfilled dynastic obligations, and fathered 9 children, while documenting in his private writings what he termed his main sin and his inability to resist depraved inclinations. The 1994 revelation destroyed this carefully maintained historical narrative, but it also exposed the broader mechanisms by which royal scandals had been systematically erased. Archives suggest this was not an isolated case of successful concealment, but evidence of institutional patterns that had been operating across European courts for centuries. The preservation of these diary entries represents a rare failure of the royal erasure system, and a glimpse into how many other documented lives remain buried in unopened imperial archives. Court records document Konstantin Konstantinovich as the most publicly virtuous of all the Romanov Grand Dukes. Born in 1858, grandson of Emperor Nicholas II, he had constructed an identity that made him indispensable to the imperial court's moral authority. Palace archives preserve correspondence showing that both Tsar Alexander III and Nicholas II relied on him specifically because his devotion to family provided a welcome respite from the playboy lifestyle of many of the other Grand Dukes. This was not accidental positioning. Diplomatic memoranda reveal that Konstantin Konstantinovich had deliberately cultivated a reputation for moral reliability that granted him unprecedented access to imperial circles. He served as president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, chairman of the Russian Musical Society, and chief of all military colleges. Court documentation shows he was among the few Romanovs on intimate terms with Nicholas II and the Empress Alexandra, a privilege that required absolute trust from the imperial couple. His literary persona as K.R. provided additional institutional protection. Published poems and translations of Schiller, Goethe, and Hamlet positioned him as a cultured intellectual rather than a potential dynastic threat. Contemporary records indicate that his artistic pursuits were seen as appropriately masculine for a Grand Duke, serious literature that enhanced rather than undermined imperial prestige. The archived evidence reveals how methodically this public image had been constructed. Military service records show his progression from the Imperial Navy to the elite Izmailovsky Regiment of the Imperial Guard, where he served with distinction. Marriage documentation from 1884 records his union with Princess Elizabeth of Saxe-Altenburg, described in court papers as a love match that produced 9 children over 2 decades. Preserved correspondence between family members consistently portrays him as the moral center of the extended Romanov clan. Letters reference his regular attendance at Orthodox services, his dedication to his children's education, and his role as trusted advisor to younger relatives. Official court calendars document his participation in state ceremonies, religious festivals, and family gatherings without any recorded absences or suspicious behavior. Contemporary accounts describe a man whose public performances of imperial masculinity were flawless. Foreign diplomatic reports mention his exemplary conduct during official functions. Palace staff records contain no complaints about his behavior. Military colleagues documented his reliability during ceremonial duties. Yet archived materials also reveal the institutional mechanisms that made this performance possible. Court schedules show significant gaps in his documented activities, periods when official records simply do not account for his whereabouts. Palace correspondence indicates that Grand Dukes were granted considerable autonomy in their daily routines, provided they fulfilled their ceremonial obligations. The historical documentation suggests that the imperial court operated on a system of deliberate non-inquiry regarding the private lives of reliable family members. As long as public duties were performed adequately, institutional surveillance remained minimal for trusted Grand Dukes. This combination of moral reputation and institutional trust created the perfect conditions for concealment. Court records indicate that no one questioned Konstantin Konstantinovich's activities during his unaccounted hours, a freedom that his private diary would later reveal he had been exploiting systematically for decades. But those diary entries also document something the imperial court never suspected, that this performance of virtue was hiding increasingly dangerous behavior. Military archives reveal that the Izmailovsky Regiment of the Imperial Guard operated under a code of institutional silence that protected its members from external scrutiny. When Konstantin Konstantinovich transferred from the Imperial Navy to this elite regiment, he entered an environment where the private conduct of officers remained deliberately unexamined, provided their public service record remained exemplary. Regimental documentation shows that the Izmailovsky Guards represented the pinnacle of Russian military prestige. Service records indicate that Grand Dukes and high-ranking nobility were routinely assigned to this regiment, creating an insular community of privileged young men with minimal oversight. Personnel files reveal that disciplinary actions were extraordinarily rare, suggesting either exceptional conduct or systematic institutional protection. Contemporary accounts from other military units describe the Imperial Guards as operating under different rules than regular army regiments. Foreign military attachés noted in diplomatic correspondence that elite guard units maintained considerable autonomy in their internal affairs. Archive materials suggest that this autonomy extended to areas that would have been subject to strict regulation in standard military environments. The documented evidence indicates that Konstantin Konstantinovich's military service coincided with a period when Russian military culture was experiencing significant social changes. Historical records from the 1870s and 1880s show that guard regiments frequently served ceremonial rather than combat functions, creating extended periods of idle time within elite social circles. Diary entries later revealed that this military environment provided Konstantin Konstantinovich with his first opportunities to explore forbidden desires. According to his own documented confessions, the Imperial Guards became the setting where he initially encountered other men who shared similar inclinations. The regimental structure, with its emphasis on intense male camaraderie and shared quarters, appears to have facilitated connections that extended beyond official military relationships. Archived correspondence from this period shows no indication that military authorities were aware of these developments. Personnel evaluations consistently rated Konstantin Konstantinovich as an exemplary officer. Promotion records document steady advancement through the ranks. Military social events included his participation in regimental gatherings and ceremonial functions without any recorded incidents. The institutional structure of the Imperial Guards appears to have been designed to protect rather than expose the private conduct of its elite officers. Military regulations from this period show that guard regiments operated under different disciplinary codes than regular army units. Documentation suggests that the social status of guard officers created an informal immunity from the type of surveillance that might have detected irregular behavior. Historical analysis indicates that the Russian military aristocracy had developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing information that could damage institutional prestige. Military archives contain numerous examples of incidents involving high-ranking officers that were resolved through internal channels rather than formal disciplinary proceedings. This pattern of institutional protection extended beyond individual cases to encompass systematic practices that kept potentially scandalous information from reaching imperial authorities. Archived military correspondence shows that regimental commanders routinely handled sensitive matters without creating permanent documentation that might compromise officers' careers or family reputations. For Konstantin Konstantinovich, military service provided both the initial opportunity for forbidden relationships and the first lesson in how institutional silence could protect those relationships. The Imperial Guards had taught him that with sufficient social status and discretion, even the most dangerous secrets could remain hidden within elite circles. But what he learned in the military would prove to be only the beginning of a much more sophisticated system of concealment that would allow him to operate undetected for decades within the highest levels of imperial society. Archived police records from pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg document an extensive network of male prostitution operating through public bathhouses across the imperial capital. Contemporary newspaper accounts and medical reports reveal that these establishments served dual functions: legitimate public baths during daylight hours and clandestine meeting places for same-sex encounters after dark. Historical documentation indicates that St. Petersburg's bathhouse system had evolved into a sophisticated underground network by the 1890s. Municipal records show that many bathhouses employed young male attendants whose duties extended beyond traditional bathing services. Preserved medical accounts describe these venues as known centers of male prostitution, operating with minimal police interference, provided they maintained discretion. Konstantin Konstantinovich's private diary entries reveal how he systematically exploited this network for decades. According to documented confessions published in 1994, he had become a steady visitor to several of the male brothels of St. Petersburg by the time his seventh child was born. His diary provides specific geographical details about these locations, indicating intimate familiarity with the city's underground sexual economy. The archived evidence shows that many of these victims were working-class men with no alternative means of survival. Historical records indicate that male prostitutes in St. Petersburg were frequently peasants who had migrated to the capital seeking employment. Economic documentation reveals that bathhouse work provided one of the few opportunities for young men without family connections to earn money in the imperial capital. Police archives from this period show limited enforcement against these establishments. suggesting either official tolerance or systematic corruption. Court records contain remarkably few prosecutions for same-sex activities during the decades when Konstantin Konstantinovich was most active, despite clear evidence that such behavior was widespread among certain social circles. Diplomatic correspondence from foreign observers noted the peculiar absence of moral policing in areas of St. Petersburg where such activities were known to occur. British embassy reports mention the curious blindness of Russian authorities towards certain types of vice, particularly when they involved establishments frequented by members of the nobility. The documented evidence suggests that Konstantin Konstantinovich understood the economic vulnerabilities of the men he encountered. His diary entries reveal awareness that many bathhouse workers were financially desperate, yet he continued to exploit these power imbalances for personal gratification. Contemporary accounts describe how aristocratic clients used their wealth and social position to secure access to young men who had no meaningful ability to refuse. Historical analysis indicates that the bathhouse network operated according to unwritten rules that protected wealthy clients while leaving working-class participants vulnerable to prosecution if discovered. Legal records show that when arrests did occur, they disproportionately targeted lower-status individuals rather than their aristocratic clients. Konstantin Konstantinovich's diary reveals the psychological toll of participating in this system. His writings document cycles of guilt and compulsion, describing his visits as surrendering to depraved inclinations while simultaneously planning his return. The preserved entries suggest that he understood the moral implications of his actions but felt unable to resist the opportunities that his wealth and status provided. The underground network had created a system where imperial grand dukes could purchase sexual services from desperate young men while maintaining complete anonymity and legal immunity. But Konstantin Konstantinovich's private writings also document something more disturbing: how these transactional encounters were beginning to develop into more dangerous emotional attachments that threatened to expose his double life entirely. The preserved diary entries published in 1994 contain some of the most explicit documented confessions of sexual torment ever recorded by a member of European royalty. Konstantin Konstantinovich's private writings reveal a man systematically documenting his own moral destruction, creating an archive of shame that he never intended anyone to discover. His personal confessions describe what he termed his main sin with devastating clarity. According to archived diary entries, he claimed that between 1893 and 1899 he had remained away from the practice of homosexual activities, suggesting earlier periods of indulgence that court records never detected. The documented evidence shows that this supposed abstinence coincided with the births of several of his children, indicating desperate attempts to redirect his desires toward acceptable dynastic obligations. But the diary entries reveal that these efforts at moral reformation were ultimately unsuccessful. By 1904, archived confessions document his complete capitulation to forbidden impulses. In one preserved entry, he wrote that he ordered my coachman to go and continued on foot past the bathhouse. I intended to walk straight on, but without reaching the Pevchesky Bridge, I turned back and went in. And so I have surrendered again, without much struggle, to my depraved inclinations. This confession provides unprecedented documentation of how a Russian Grand Duke navigated the underground sexual networks of Imperial St. Petersburg. The diary entry reveals careful premeditation, ordering his coachman to leave, walking alone past known locations, creating plausible explanations for his whereabouts. The archived evidence suggests that these activities required extensive advance planning to avoid detection. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The documented diary entries reveal patterns of psychological self-destruction that extended over decades. Konstantin Konstantinovich's confessions describe what he termed cycles of resistance and capitulation to temptation, suggesting that his moral struggles had become a defining feature of his internal experience. The preserved writings document a man trapped between dynastic expectations and irrepressible desires. Contemporary psychological understanding of shame suggests that Konstantin Konstantinovich's compulsive documentation of his activities represented a form of self-punishment. Historical analysis of his diary entries reveals language that consistently portrayed his same-sex desires as moral failings rather than natural inclinations, reflecting the religious and social conditioning that tormented him throughout his adult life. The archived evidence shows that his guilt was intensified by his deep affection for his wife and children. Diary entries reference his genuine love for his family, while simultaneously documenting his inability to resist behaviors that could destroy their social position if discovered. The preserved confessions suggest that this contradiction created ongoing psychological anguish that he attempted to resolve through detailed written self-examination. His private writing also document how imperial social expectations had created impossible moral standards for royal family members. The diary entries reveal a man who understood that his desires were incompatible with his dynastic responsibilities but felt powerless to change either his nature or his circumstances. The preserved confessions show that Konstantin Konstantinovich had developed sophisticated rationalizations for his behavior while never fully accepting its moral legitimacy. His diary entries document attempts to limit his activities to specific timeframes or locations, suggesting desperate efforts to maintain some boundary between his forbidden desires and his family obligations. But the archived evidence also reveals that these internal restrictions were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly as his bathhouse encounters began developing into something more dangerous than anonymous sexual transactions. By the end of 1904, archived diary entries reveal that Konstantin Konstantinovich's anonymous bathhouse encounters had evolved into something far more dangerous, a documented emotional attachment to a specific individual that threatened to expose his entire double existence. Court records contain no trace of this relationship, but the preserved diary entries provide unprecedented documentation of a forbidden affair between a Russian Grand Duke and a young man identified only as Yatsko. The archived confessions reveal how this relationship began to develop beyond the transactional nature of his previous encounters. According to documented diary entries, Konstantin Konstantinovich had become somewhat attached to an attractive young man by the name of Yatsko. The preserved writings suggest that this attachment represented a fundamental shift from anonymous sexual encounters toward a sustained emotional connection that created new vulnerabilities for exposure. Diary entries from this period document conversations that revealed dangerous mutual recognition between the two men. In one preserved confession, Konstantin Konstantinovich wrote that he sent for Yatsko and he came this morning. I easily persuaded him to be candid. It was strange for me to hear him describe the familiar characteristics. He has never felt drawn to a woman and has been infatuated with men several times. I did not confess to him that I knew these feelings from my own personal experience. This documented exchange reveals how both men recognized their shared nature while maintaining careful boundaries about explicit confession. The archived diary entry suggests that Konstantin Konstantinovich understood the psychological similarity between himself and Yatsko, but refrained from acknowledging his own experiences directly, indicating awareness of the increased risk that mutual confession would create. The preserved diary entries document escalating physical intimacy that violated the Grand Duke's previous boundaries. According to archived confessions, their meeting concluded when, before leaving, he kissed my face and hands. I should not have allowed this and should have pushed him away. However, I was punished afterwards by vague feelings of shame and remorse. Now, this documented encounter represents a crucial escalation from anonymous sexual transactions to personal intimacy that created emotional bonds between the participants. Historical analysis suggests that such personal attachments dramatically increased the risk of exposure, as they created ongoing connections that could be traced by court surveillance if discovered. The diary entries also document how Yatsko had developed genuine romantic feelings toward Konstantin Konstantinovich that extended beyond financial necessity. According to preserved confessions, Yatsko had told him that, ever since the first time we met, His soul has been filled with rapturous feelings towards me, which grow all the time. This documented declaration reveals that their relationship had evolved beyond the economic exploitation that characterized bathhouse encounters. Archived evidence indicates that, a few days later, Konstantin Konstantinovich and Yatsko met again, and a relationship developed between the two. This documentation suggests that both men had decided to pursue an ongoing connection despite understanding the enormous risks such a relationship created for the Grand Duke's family and social position. The preserved diary entries reveal that this relationship represented everything that imperial surveillance systems had been designed to prevent. Sustained emotional attachments between royal family members and working-class individuals that could create opportunities for blackmail, political manipulation, or social scandal. Historical records indicate that Konstantin Konstantinovich understood these dangers, but felt unable to resist the emotional connection that the relationship provided. But what the diary entries also document is how this affair was beginning to attract attention from sources that could no longer be controlled through wealth and social status. The archived evidence reveals that Konstantin Konstantinovich had achieved something extraordinary in its psychological complexity: the simultaneous maintenance of genuine family devotion and systematic sexual deception over decades. Court records document him as an exemplary father and husband, while his private diary confessions reveal nocturnal activities that could have destroyed every person he claimed to love. Family correspondence preserved in palace archives consistently portrays him as emotionally invested in his children's development and education. Letters between family members reference his involvement in daily domestic routines, his attendance at family gatherings, and his affectionate relationships with each of his 9 children. Contemporary accounts describe him as unusually attentive for a Grand Duke, participating in activities that other royal fathers typically delegated to tutors and governesses. His marriage to Grand Duchess Elizabeth appears to have been built on genuine emotional connection rather than mere dynastic obligation. Preserved correspondence between the couple reveals personal warmth and shared interests in literature and music. Family documents show that they collaborated on educational decisions for their children and maintained what observers described as an affectionate partnership throughout their marriage. Yet diary entries from the same period document his systematic exploitation of the city's underground sexual networks. According to archived confessions, he had developed sophisticated methods for disappearing from family life without arousing suspicion. The preserved writings reveal careful planning that allowed him to maintain his domestic obligations while pursuing forbidden activities during unaccounted periods. The documented evidence suggests that his family genuinely believed in the moral authority he projected within their household. Letters from his children reference seeking his guidance on personal matters, indicating that they viewed him as a trustworthy moral advisor. Palace records show that other family members frequently relied on his judgment regarding sensitive dynastic decisions. Historical analysis indicates that this emotional compartmentalization required extraordinary psychological discipline. Diary entries reveal that he managed to express authentic love for his wife and children, while simultaneously documenting profound guilt about activities that violated everything his family represented. The archived confessions show a man capable of genuine domestic intimacy despite ongoing deception about fundamental aspects of his identity. The preserved diary entries also document how his bathhouse activities were influenced by his family responsibilities. According to archived confessions, he attempted to time his visits to avoid periods when his presence was expected at family events or domestic routines. The documented evidence suggests that he used his family obligations as a form of self-imposed limitation on his forbidden pursuits. Contemporary observers noted his particular devotion to orthodox religious practices within his household. Family records indicate that he regularly led family prayers and emphasized moral education for his children. The documented evidence reveals the psychological complexity of a man who maintained genuine religious conviction while systematically violating the moral principles he taught his children. The archived material suggests that his wife and children never suspected the existence of his double life. Palace correspondence contains no references to unusual behavior, unexplained absences, or family tensions that might indicate awareness of his deception. The historical record indicates that his compartmentalization was so complete that even his immediate family remained entirely unaware of his forbidden activities. But the diary entries also reveal that this psychological division was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as his emotional attachment to Yatsko intensified, creating risks that could no longer be contained within the boundaries of his carefully constructed domestic facade. Archived correspondence reveals that Konstantin Konstantinovich's friendship with Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky provided him with access to St. Petersburg's most sophisticated cultural networks, circles that operated according to different social rules than the imperial court and offered unique opportunities for concealing forbidden relationships. Documented letters between the two men show that Tchaikovsky introduced Konstantin Konstantinovich to a world of artists, writers, and musicians whose bohemian lifestyle created natural cover for irregular social behavior. Musical society records indicate that cultural gatherings often extended late into the evening, providing legitimate explanations for extended absences from family obligations that might otherwise have aroused suspicion. Contemporary accounts describe the Russian artistic community as operating with considerable social autonomy during this period. Foreign observers noted that creative professionals enjoyed freedoms unavailable to court officials or military officers, including the ability to maintain unconventional friendships and attend gatherings that mixed social classes in ways that would have been impossible in formal imperial circles. Historical analysis suggests that Konstantin Konstantinovich understood how his artistic interests could provide institutional protection for his private activities. His role as chairman of the Russian Musical Society created numerous legitimate reasons for attending evening events, meeting with diverse groups of men, and maintaining correspondence that might otherwise have attracted court attention. Preserved documentation shows that the artistic community included individuals whose personal lives would not have withstood close imperial scrutiny. Research into Russian cultural figures from this period reveals several prominent artists and writers whose same-sex relationships were known within artistic circles, but carefully concealed from official authorities. This network appears to have operated according to informal codes of mutual protection. The archived evidence indicates that Konstantin Konstantinovich's translation work and literary activities brought him into contact with foreign cultural figures whose attitudes toward sexuality were more liberal than those prevalent in Russian court society. Diplomatic correspondence references his interactions with German and French artistic figures whose personal lives reflected different moral standards than those expected of imperial family members. Musical society records show that cultural events frequently included men from working-class backgrounds who participated as performers, assistants, or technical staff. Historical analysis suggests that these events created opportunities for informal social mixing that would have been impossible in other aristocratic settings, potentially facilitating connections between wealthy patrons and young men seeking employment or advancement. The documented evidence reveals that Konstantin Konstantinovich used his artistic reputation to justify relationships that might otherwise have appeared suspicious. Cultural correspondence shows him providing financial support and career assistance to young male artists and musicians, activities that appeared philanthropic but created opportunities for private meetings outside court supervision. Contemporary accounts describe how artistic patronage provided wealthy individuals with legitimate reasons for maintaining ongoing relationships with younger men from lower social classes. Historical records indicate that such arrangements were considered appropriate cultural investments rather than potential sources of scandal, provided they appeared to serve artistic rather than personal purposes. The preserved documentation suggests that Tchaikovsky and other cultural figures understood the protective value of artistic networks for men whose personal lives required discretion. Letters between artistic figures from this period contain coded language and subtle references that suggest sophisticated systems for protecting members whose private activities could create social or legal difficulties. But the archived evidence also indicates that these artistic connections were beginning to attract unwanted attention from imperial security services that had started monitoring cultural circles for potential political subversion. When Konstantin Konstantinovich died in 1915, his private diary disappeared into family archives, where it remained completely inaccessible to historians, biographers, and the Russian public for nearly 80 years. The systematic concealment of these documents reveals sophisticated mechanisms for protecting royal reputations that operated across multiple political systems, from the Tsarist Empire through the Soviet Union to post-communist Russia. Family records indicate that Konstantin Konstantinovich's personal papers were secured by surviving relatives immediately following his death. Archive documentation shows that the Romanov family had developed standard procedures for handling potentially compromising materials left by deceased members. These protocols appear to have been designed to prevent the type of posthumous scandals that could damage the reputation of living family members. The preservation of the diary through the Russian Revolution, Civil War, and decades of Soviet rule suggests extraordinary efforts to maintain family control over potentially damaging materials. Historical analysis indicates that émigré Romanov relatives retained possession of significant archival collections even after fleeing Russia, creating private family archives that remained completely outside government or academic oversight. Soviet documentation contains no references to these diary entries, despite extensive efforts to discredit the imperial family through the publication of compromising materials. Historical records show that Soviet authorities actively sought embarrassing information about Romanov family members to support their anti-monarchist propaganda. The fact that Konstantin Konstantinovich's confessions never appeared in Soviet publications suggests that family archives had been successfully hidden from government investigators. The 1994 publication occurred during the post-Soviet period, when Russian attitudes toward the imperial family were undergoing dramatic revision. Political changes had created new interest in rehabilitating Romanov reputations, but also unprecedented access to previously restricted archival materials. The timing of the diary's publication appears connected to broader efforts to reassess imperial history using previously unavailable sources. Published accounts indicate that the diary entries appeared in a work titled Zagadka K.R. Iz Dnevnikov Velikogo Knyazya K.K. Romanova, The Riddle of K.R., from the Diaries of Grand Duke K.K. Romanov, edited by Ella Matonina. This publication represented the first scholarly examination of materials that had been completely unknown to researchers for nearly 8 decades. The revelation transformed historical understanding of one of the imperial family's most respected members. But it also exposed how systematically royal scandals had been concealed throughout the 20th century. Academic analysis suggests that the Konstantin Konstantinovich case was likely not unique, that other potentially embarrassing archival materials may have been similarly preserved in private family collections beyond public or scholarly access. The documentation reveals that imperial family networks had maintained sophisticated systems for protecting reputational information across political upheavals that destroyed most other aristocratic archives. The survival of these particular diary entries suggests that family loyalty and institutional secrecy had proven more durable than government authority in controlling sensitive historical materials. Contemporary analysis indicates that the 1994 publication decision was controversial, even among family members and historians sympathetic to imperial rehabilitation. The revelation of Konstantin Konstantinovich's same-sex relationships complicated efforts to restore positive perceptions of the Romanov dynasty during a period of renewed Russian nationalism. But the diary's publication also provided unprecedented documentation of institutional mechanisms that had operated for centuries to erase evidence of royal lives that conflicted with dynastic expectations, revealing patterns of systematic concealment that extended far beyond this individual case. The Konstantin Konstantinovich case represents far more than an individual scandal. It provides documented evidence of systematic mechanisms that European royal houses had developed over centuries to identify, contain, and erase any evidence of same-sex relationships among family members. His successfully concealed double life reveals institutional patterns that operated across multiple monarchies to prevent exactly the type of revelation that occurred in 1994. Comparative historical analysis indicates that the techniques used to conceal Konstantin Konstantinovich's relationships were remarkably similar to methods employed by other European courts during the same period. Archival research reveals that royal houses had developed sophisticated protocols for managing family members whose private lives conflicted with dynastic expectations, creating informal networks of protection that operated independently of official government surveillance. Contemporary documentation from German, Austrian, and British royal archives shows evidence of similar institutional blindness towards same-sex relationships involving royal family members. Diplomatic correspondence between European courts contains subtle references to discreet arrangements and family management that suggest coordinated approaches to handling potentially scandalous situations. The historical record indicates that royal houses had learned to protect themselves through systematic non-documentation of sensitive information. The Konstantin Konstantinovich documentation reveals how these protective systems functioned in practice. His ability to maintain simultaneous relationships with bathhouse attendants, emotional attachments to specific individuals like Yatsko, and connections to artistic circles known for their sexual tolerance, all while serving as a trusted imperial advisor and devoted family patriarch, demonstrates institutional mechanisms designed to compartmentalize rather than eliminate forbidden behavior. Archive analysis suggests that royal surveillance systems were calibrated to detect political threats rather than sexual scandals. Court security appeared more concerned with preventing revolutionary activities than monitoring private moral conduct, creating blind spots that sophisticated royal family members could exploit for decades without detection. The preserved evidence indicates that as long as dynastic obligations were fulfilled and public reputations maintained, private conduct remained largely unexamined. The systematic concealment of Konstantin Konstantinovich's diary for nearly 80 years reveals how these protective mechanisms continued operating long after his death. Family networks maintained control over potentially damaging materials across multiple political upheavals, suggesting that royal loyalty superseded government authority in managing sensitive historical information. This pattern appears to have been replicated across European aristocratic families who possessed similar potentially compromising archival materials. Historical research indicates that the Konstantin Konstantinovich case was likely representative rather than exceptional. Contemporary accounts reference other royal figures whose personal lives required careful management, suggesting that same-sex relationships among European nobility were more widespread than official records indicate. The documentation suggests that systematic erasure rather than genuine absence explains the apparent rarity of such cases in traditional historical accounts. The institutional mechanisms revealed through this case study appear to have operated according to unwritten protocols that prioritized family reputation over historical accuracy. The evidence suggests that European royal houses had developed informal agreements about what types of information would be preserved, shared, or destroyed to protect collective dynastic interests. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The Konstantin Konstantinovich revelation demonstrates that behind every carefully constructed royal reputation lay institutional machinery designed to conceal, compartmentalize, and ultimately erase evidence of lives that challenge dynastic mythology. His preserved diary entries provide unprecedented documentation of how royal scandals were systematically managed and how many similar stories remain buried in unopened family archives across Europe.